Om Ajnanatimidandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Dhena Tasmai Shri Gurave. As I was saying, the verse today is Canto 4, Chapter 21, text number 26. Yuyam tad anumodadvam pitri devarshayo mala kartu shastru anudatus tulyam yat pretyatat palam. Yuyam, all you respectable persons who are present here. Tat, that. Anumodatvam, kindly approve of my proposal. Pitri, persons coming from Pitriloka. Deva, persons coming from the heavenly planets. Rishaya, great sages and saintly persons. Amala, those who are cleansed of all sinful activities. Kartu, the performer. Shashtu, the order giver. Anugyatu, of the supporter. Tulyam, equal. Yat, which. Pretya, after death. Tat, that. Palam, result. Translation: I request all the pure-hearted demigods, forefathers, and saintly persons to support my proposal. For after death, the result of an action is equally shared by its doer, its director, and its supporter. Purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. The government of Prithu Maharaj was perfect because it was administered exactly according to the orders of the Vedic injunctions. Prithu Maharaj has already explained that the chief duty of the government is to see that everyone executes his respective duty and is elevated to the platform of Krishna consciousness. The government should be so conducted that automatically one is elevated to Krishna consciousness. King Prithu therefore wanted his citizens to cooperate fully with him, for if they assented, they would enjoy the same profit as he after death. If Prithu Maharaj as a perfect king were elevated to the heavenly planets, the citizens who cooperated by approving of his methods would also be elevated with him. Since the Krishna consciousness movement is going on at the present moment, is genuine, perfect, and authorized, which three things is it? Genuine, perfect, and authorized. GPA. And is following in the footsteps of Prithu Maharaj. Anyone who cooperates with this movement or accepts its principles will get the same results as the workers who are actively propagating Krishna consciousness. I offer my respectful obeisances to the lotus feet of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada and to all the Vaishnavas who are present here today, because you are the most worshipable of all living entities in the universe. Hare Krishna. And there's a theme that Vrinda Sundari gave me to speak on today, which I liked very much, which is personhood implies varying perspectives. How to appreciate and harmonize, work together with varying perspectives, varying moods and methods. And the translation again is, I request all pure-hearted demigods, forefathers, and saintly persons to support my proposal, for after death, the result of an action is equally shared by its doer, its director, and its supporter. And this is quite astounding, because we hear now that by just cooperating, one gets the same result as those who are teaching the principles. For instance, the acharyas are showing us the way, and if we cooperate to the best of our ability in whatever capacity we're cooperating, or even that we appreciate the principles, then we get the same result. And In Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's commentary, he says that the person who teaches the duty, the performer of the duty, and those who approve the duty, they approve of it, also get the same result, an equal result. So this indicates already that there are various ways in which devotees participate in the overall mission of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Some of them are actively engaged in the services, some of them are teaching it, some of them are appreciating it, some of them are approving of it, and so forth. And from all these angles of vision, according to the capacity of the person, like for instance, sometimes we meet people who don't have capacity to do a lot of active service, but they give a lot of appreciation for the Krishna consciousness movement. They approve of it. So this is very good. I like what you guys are doing, and so forth. And to the best of their ability, they extend their goodwill. They also get benefit, even though there are various personalities and different moods and capacities. So in the universe, there is no one particle that's the same as another. There's no one sunset that's the same as another. There's no circumstance that's the same as another. There is no living entity that's the same as another. One of the miracles of Krishna's creation, which is called Vaisesika, everything in it is special and unique. And that's one of the reasons, or the main reason, that there's rasa, because there is variety. Variety is the mother of enjoyment. And when you get varieties of living entities together, you find that there's different kinds of conflict. And conflict is interesting. Of course, even in corporate management, there's a discussion of good conflict and bad conflict. Positive, they say, positive conflict, and conflict that is detrimental. But there is no conscious living entity that doesn't have his or her own impetus and way of doing or seeing things. Although it may be tied into the greater vision, for instance, in our Krishna consciousness movement, of the mission of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, still there are many ways of participating and many ways of seeing the movement. So Prabhupada encouraged this. He said that in a directive to one of the managers of ISKCON, Karandar Prabhu, that we should train the devotees who are coming into the Krishna consciousness movement to be independently thoughtful. And that means there's an opposite concept, which is also mentioned in management terms as groupthink, during which there's a lot of inefficiencies because of groupthink. In fact, a lot of problems take place because of that. I think I have a definition of it right here, in case you were wondering what it means exactly. Groupthink occurs when conformity and compliance pressures are exaggerated, and it generally occurs in the absence of task conflict. So how are you to know if your group is falling prey to conformity pressures and groupthink? Here are some common symptoms. Illusions of invulnerability, rationalization and justification, illusion of group morality, stereotyping the outgroup as weaker, evil, or stupid, direct or indirect peer or supervisory pressures, self-censorship by team members, illusions of unanimity. And contrast that with the idea of being independently thoughtful. And of course, everyone who's cooperating within an organization, as we hear in this verse today, Prithu Maharaj is the undisputed king, and rightly so. He's a Shaktivesh avatar of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and he's perfectly following the Vedas And therefore he's giving rules that, if followed, will bring good fortune to everybody. And even if one simply appreciates what he's doing and approves of it, then they also make advancement in such an environment. And develop his or her own service. And in the same letter, the directive that I just mentioned, in which Prabhupada said we should train devotees to be independently thoughtful, Prabhupada said that we should create an environment in which the devotees do service that's individual, spontaneous, and voluntary. Independent, spontaneous, and voluntary. And interestingly, at least to me, there's a parallel to this in the corporate management systems and the theories behind it. And I mentioned negative conflict and also positive conflict. So in positive conflict, there's a way, it's called any tolerable amount of conflict is vital to group success in order to avoid groupthink and to generate more innovative ideas among potentially and vastly differing members of the group. In addition, positive conflict generates buy-in and offers elements of ownership and a sense of cooperation and enhanced membership to all the group members. Positive conflict reduces the effects of conformity pressures and groupthink. So, some of the ways in which I'm being very technical right now because I'm trying to make a case that there is a perfect balance between the individuality of each devotee and also the idea of consensus and cooperation. And in corporate management, there's the positive conflict benefits or the ways to encourage them. The kind of a positive conflict. There's a term called intrapreneurship. You've heard of entrepreneurship, which means risk-taking and innovation and so forth, right? So intrapreneurship is a term which means that within the greater organization, people are encouraged within their own groups to also take risks and innovate, to try to develop their own aspects, their own services. We say in our temple, we're encouraging devotees, empowering them. In fact, this is a concept that Prabhupada brought up. He contrasted empowerment with bureaucracy. And bureaucracy, he said, is a managerial structure which is designed to say no to everything. Whatever you want to do, no. And it can be based on the fact that sometimes there's envy. In fact, in Michael's law of ironclad laws of oligarchy, he states that there's an unwavering principle that he's stating, and that is when people get in power, when little jivas who have a false ego get in power, then they do everything they can to stay in power, and they use all of their resources to protect their power structure rather than innovating and trying to expand. So they stay insulated. So there's an enlightened way of managing, and within that there's a way in which we might just say no to everything, because we don't want people to rise up. We don't want them to be entrepreneurs, to be innovative and develop individual, spontaneous, and voluntary service. So therefore, we try to stifle everyone. And oftentimes leaders like this end up not being able to create more leaders. They end up, when people rise to a certain level of competency, they become afraid of them and they send them away somewhere else. Or they just squash them psychologically or cut off their resources because it becomes a threat to their own power. So entrepreneurship is the opposite of that. It's an enlightened environment in which people are empowered and encouraged within the greater organization to innovate and take risk and try to expand. The kind of empowerment, which is the opposite. I don't know if it's the perfect opposite, but the concepts of bureaucracy of saying no and empowerment are in opposition. So then the other means of developing this positive conflict is to develop collaboration with diverse individuals. In fact, to encourage that, find ways in which there's diversity within your organization, and find out the ways in which these diverse individuals can collaborate. And focus on the strengths of the individuals. This is how this is done. And there are scientific studies that have been done that show that when there's diversity, there's actually more strength. For instance, in botany, I read a study about how when there are various plants, in other words, a variety of species are planted together, they tend to grow stronger. According to the botanists, this is their subjective way of looking at it, they're competing. They can sense that there are other species there, so they grow stronger and higher. Whereas if they're all the same species, they grow, they're a little more docile. And so in management, this principle is also brought out that when there's individuality, and that's encouraged, and we look for the strength in that, or we augment the differences as being potential for strength when there's collaboration, then the organization grows in a very healthy way because of the differences. And one of the other suggestions given in this type of enlightened management is that one should stand up to discrimination. In other words, there's ways in which living entities naturally discriminate against one another when they see differences. And to, in an organization, be careful not to allow discrimination based on differences to stand, because that can also hamper the overall spirit of the organization. And before I say more, I'll just see if you have any reflections. Yes, Ananda.
Thank you so much for classes. It's a very pertinent topic. Vinod and I were discussing yesterday just about kind of our enthusiasm about all the different programs that are developing here in terms of we have the Bhakti program and Brahmacharya Ashram and just different ways that the different houses and things and spaces will be used. And one thing I was reflecting upon was that in my travels, just meeting so many different devotees from so many different levels and walks of life and backgrounds and levels of involvement, I was really appreciating this point that Prabhupada was making in the purport where he was saying even if they just agree, if they just appreciate the principles, then they're benefited. And what we were reflecting on yesterday was that our job, our service as a community is to create more and more opportunities for people to somehow engage in service and hearing and chanting. So like different environments that they're comfortable and able to enter into where they can engage in hearing and chanting. So
I like your formula. I would like to this is in the same context from the Chaitanya Charitamrita Madhya Lila, chapter 15, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya offers prasadam. There's a section here in which Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is giving advice to various kinds of devotees. First he meets devotees from Kulinagram and then from Shikanda. And when he meets the devotees from Kanda, there's Mukunda, Raghunath, and Sri Narahari. So Mahaprabhu begins to glorify the devotees, these devotees. First he talks about Mukunda, and Mukunda, you probably all remember, was the devotee who was a physician, and once he was fanning the king, he was the royal physician actually, and because he saw the peacock fan, he became overwhelmed with ecstasy, and he fainted, and he was on a high platform, so he fell off of it and crashed to the ground. And the king came over to see what happened to his physician. He said, "Are you all right?" He said, "Oh yes, I'm fine." And he said, "What happened?" He said, "I have something like epilepsy." But the king was very intelligent, and he could understand what had happened, and he saw that this is an extraordinarily advanced pure devotee. So Mahaprabhu was glorifying Mukunda, and then Mukunda, then he says that he asked Mukunda about his son, Raghunandana. And he asked, "Are you the father or are you the son?" And then Mukunda said, "Actually, Raghunandana is my father, I'm his son," because Raghunandana introduced our family to devotional service. And then Mahaprabhu approved of that principle. And then he gave instructions to all three of them, Raghunandana, Mukunda, and Sri Narahari. So he says, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu again spoke to Mukunda with sweet words. "Your duty is to earn both material and spiritual wealth. Furthermore, is the duty of Raghunandana to always engage in Lord Krishna's service. He has no other intention but the service of Lord Krishna." Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu then ordered Narahari, "I wish you to remain here with my devotees. In this way, the three of you should always execute these three duties for the service of the Lord." Prabhupada's purport. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu set forth three duties for three different people. Mukunda was to earn money and follow the religious principles, whereas Narahari was to remain with the Lord's devotees, and Raghunandana was to engage in the Lord's service in the temple. Thus, one person worships in the temple, another earns money honestly by executing his professional duty, and yet another preaches Krishna consciousness with the devotees. Apparently, these three types of service appear separate, but actually they are not. When Krishna or Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is the center, everyone can engage in different activities for the service of the Lord. That is the verdict of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. I close my case. So this is an example, and there are others, in the way that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu dealt with his many devotees, in which he encouraged each person according to their capacity to work in that capacity, and considered all of their services to be equal. Yes. Oh, you grabbed the microphone, so I thought. Okay. Yes. Was there any more reflections before I keep going? Yes, Vrindasundari, since it's your topic.
I appreciate the point of conflict.
What do you appreciate about it?
It seems that the tendency for most, it seems, from the perspective, that the tendency most is to avoid any conflict.
Right.
Thinking that it's all bad.
Yeah, so if we look in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, we'll find that even pure devotees have conflict. I'm thinking right now of the Ratha Yatra, and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was dancing, during which Maharaj Prataparudra and all the other devotees were trying to have a look at Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his ecstatic dancing. So Hari Chandana was the enforcer. Apparently he was big and strong. So he used to take the king around through the crowds, and if you've been to the Ratha Yatra at Jagannath Puri, you know you need either to be a little stout and aggressive, or you have to have some guide to get you through. And so Hari Chandana would take the king through the crowds, and at one point, when everyone was watching Chaitanya Mahaprabhu dance, Srivas Thakur was standing at a point where the king couldn't see Lord Chaitanya dancing. So Hari Chandana, being the king's assistant, then tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Move a little, king can't see." And Srivas Thakur, being absorbed in watching the dancing, didn't move, so Hari Chandana did it again. And in this kind of ecstasy of watching the Lord and then being touched and pushed, and not understanding why he was being touched and pushed, Srivas Thakur became a little angry, so he slapped Hari Chandana. And Hari Chandana was just about to retort and say something, but King Prataparudra then said, "I am not so fortunate. I have not been slapped by a pure devotee. You're the fortunate one." And he diffused the situation. I bring this up to point out that Prabhupada gave us directives to appreciate the fact that there will be positive conflict. There will be conflict In fact, he wrote a letter to Atreya Rishi, who was a manager at the time, in which he says that utopia, he said, don't expect utopia even within the realm of spiritual practice and amongst the devotees in the devotional community, because Atreya Rishi had written to complain to Prabhupada that there was some dissension among the leaders. And he said that, isn't this Mayavad? So Prabhupada said, actually, your conception that there will be no conflict is Mayavad. And he said the reason is because every living entity is individual, eternally, and therefore has his or her own impetus in practicing devotional service. And he said, even in the spiritual world, because he said within personality there is also some fault. And then he said in the spiritual world, sometimes Krishna, because he's enamored of Radharani, then instead of milking a cow, he accidentally milks a bull because he's bewildered. And he goes on to say that one should accept the fact that there's this conflict due to the individual nature of the living entity. And he thought of presented the utopian idea that there would be no conflict when we come to spiritual life, that everything would be perfectly harmonized. Well, that's not the right term, because actually it is perfectly harmonized, even within the individuality. But Atreya Rishi's idea that there'll be no conflict, and that means harmony, Prabhupada disputed and said was incorrect. So in the Brahma Samhita, in the verse beginning with Shriya Kanta Kanta Parama Purusha Kalpataravo Druma Bhumish Chintamani Ganami Toyam Amritam, where there's a description of the spiritual world and how the living entities, all the devotees are dancing together and serving Krishna. We hear that in Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's translation that all living entities there are enjoyable and tasty. And we know from those who produce, for instance, television shows, unless you put characters in the shows, people won't watch them. If they're just boring people, nobody's interested. But everyone wants characters. And the living entity is full of character, because it's part and parcel of Krishna, who's the source of all characteristics. And therefore, when there's conflict, even in storylines, then it becomes interesting. And that's rasa. And that happens in the spiritual world. There's constantly positive conflict in the spiritual world. And that's what makes it enjoyable and tasty. That's my point. Reflections, yes.
I was appreciating how the way that Srila Prabhupada is talking about those who cooperate with this movement get the same result. It reminded me of the purport of Bhagavad-gita 3:31, where Srila Prabhupada says that if you don't present the principle, if you can't follow it right away, then you become elevated to be able to follow it in time. So it seems like part of what he's saying is that in a healthy society there are always going to be devotees at different levels of advancement, different levels of adherence to the external rules and regulations. And that's to be expected. And the principle is that one should actually just cooperate with, appreciate that the thing actually makes sense, and go on with it as far as one can at any given time. And by that attitude of cooperation, they become elevated. Seems like a nice way to reconcile, because like a very conservative idea is that everyone has to follow everything externally all the time, right away. But that's not how the world works. That's not how Krishna sets up the Shastra either. There's always things for people to plug in however they can.
Nice points and well put. And you can pass the microphone that way. Doesn't it give some sense of relief for those working within an organization with a common cause who experience conflict to know that it's a natural part of it's a natural part of the way things are. It's not an anomaly. Does it make you feel better? Yes? Let the record show that Vinod Kovita feels better after hearing this. Yes, please go ahead.
I like what you said about conflict, because it's known that every good story has conflict, and then there's a resolution usually later. But I have a question. You mentioned discrimination. Is discrimination always a bad thing? Is there good discrimination? Because I've seen that if one group in a society is favored, then other groups, they feel kind of left out.
Yeah, well, here in this context, because I only gave the subheading and I didn't give a lot of the details of what it was describing, a discrimination in the way of disparaging people's unique abilities or qualities. And that often happens. Sometimes even in the animal species, if an animal is born in a certain tribe or group, if it looks a little bit different, the parents or others may outcast that animal and push it away or even kill it. And similarly, there's ways in which we sometimes, if people don't perfectly conform to the way that we are used to, then we just, I would use the word prejudice more than discrimination. We prejudge them and don't consider their contribution valuable. But the point in this context is that because variety is actually useful and interesting, that we shouldn't prejudge people, but appreciate the fact that they have some different way of looking at things in order to assimilate it. And it can become useful. Of course there's discrimination. I mean, human beings are rational. We have to discriminate, and if somebody is intentionally discordant in an organization or doesn't cooperate with the principles and the principle of the organization, then that person should be marginalized to a certain degree because it disturbs everything. And this is in the commentary of the Acharyas in the verse in the 11th canto, Sve Sve Adhikarya Nishta Saguna Parikirtita. In this verse, Lord Krishna is saying that everyone should act according to their own capability. Everyone has an adhikar, or a certain capacity or capability, and if they act according to that natural capability that they have, then Krishna says it's a guna, it's a good quality. And then he says, viparyat doshasya, the opposite is true, that it's a fault, that if they don't act according to their nature in devotional service, then it's a fault. So, yes.
Thanks, Guru. So I was just wondering if you could say something about there's our independence and our individuality, and then at the same time there's our common cause and our conformity to some extent. So what about the doing the needful syndrome that many times happened in the past, where so many employees were kind of funneled into, maybe distributing Krishna consciousness, not really feeling like that was their individual calling, but yet it was the needful. So maybe you might be saying something about that.
Well, everything has to do with the success of those kinds of endeavors have a lot to do with the success or non-success, have a lot to do with the attitude and the mood in which they're implemented. And sometimes when the needful has to be done and or when there's an emergency situation, or when a leader decides everything should go in a certain direction, then people can be encouraged to take part in some of those emergency works or in doing the needful in ways that they don't become discouraged from the service itself. Considering that people, when they're given an environment in which they feel like they're not being pressured into it so much, tend to do more. If they're encouraged rather than pressured, then they do more, ultimately. And that's what Prabhupada meant by individual spontaneous and voluntary service, creating an environment in which they want to do it. They want to step up and do it. So that's an art of management that he's delineating in the letter to Karundar Prabhu. That it's up to those who are leading to create that kind of environment so people don't feel stifled by the kinds of things that you're encouraging them to do. For instance, we find that just recently we did a couple of seminars in temples where we were introducing the idea of everybody going out to distribute books together. And a lot of the people had never been out on book distribution before. And when we introduced the concept, we said that the goal is not to distribute books, the goal is just to go out and touch the pavement when you get out there. And once you've done that, then you're finished for the day, and there's no other obligation. And it's noticeable how the group anxiety comes down and down and down as I reassure them. In fact, I repeated that statement about 5 or 6 times during the seminar leading up to the time in which we would all go out. Because I've seen before that even in the most encouraging of seminars, if people feel forced, or if they're not encouraged, that just by going out or just by trying to do the service they're successful, that they can become overwhelmed and not want to do it. So in the case of the book distribution, I saw a lot of people finally become relaxed enough to walk out the door and go out for the book distribution. Even now I'm watching in that one of those groups that we worked with, they're writing to each other, well, let's just go out and touch the pavement. We're not going out to distribute books, we're going out to touch the pavement. So the reason I present it that way is because I've seen in the past ways in which people felt maybe too much force, to do a certain thing or have a quota to do a certain number of things. And it was not that those are completely taboo, but there's a way in which they can be administered so that everyone's encouraged to do it.
Krishna, I was just thinking about how our society is a melting pot of different cultures, and a lot of times devotees don't always see eye to eye. So how do we avoid from being discouraged when things don't go the way that you think they should, or you think that things could be done in a different way?
Because somebody else did it in a way, like somebody decorates something and you think like, that's terrible. Like I would have done it a different way. Well, first of all, we can't avoid these differences, and therefore we have to adapt to them at a certain point, and that means finding a common principle that we appreciate. Whatever way in which people do things. Prabhupada brings this out in the Nectar of Devotion when he talks about how there are principles and details. And the overarching principle for our movement is given in the beginning of Srimad Bhagavatam, Dharma Protita Kaitavo Traparamo Nirmatsaranam Satam. It's the intention of our movement is to perform pure devotional service. And if the purity is there, the purity in the attitude is there, if there are slight differences in the way people do things, we don't mind. Or at least that's how you can avoid becoming disturbed, because you can appreciate that they're doing it purely to the best of their ability. They may be very different in their approach because of their culture or their resources. For instance, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, 10th canto, there's a story of 2 devotees, live in the same city called Matila. One of them is named Shrutadev and the other is Bahulashva. So, one of them is a great Brahmana, but very renounced. It doesn't have any possessions, and the other is a king. And Krishna suddenly decides, one day that he's going to go visit both of them. So he gets on his chariot, and all the great sages come along with him. Vyasadeva was there, in fact, Narada Muni, and just a host of the most famous sadhus and sages in the universe. And so Krishna rode on his chariot, and people came to see him all the way till he got to Mithila, and all the people from the city came to greet him. And Shrutadev and Bahulashva both came and greeted him, and they already knew, because Krishna is the super soul within their hearts, that Krishna had come to see them. And both of them were pure devotees. One was a king, and the other was a very poor Brahmin. And so Krishna greeted them, and then he expanded himself. So Shrutadev thought that Krishna is only coming to my house, and Bahulashva thought he only is coming to my palace. So he came to the palace of the king, and the king gave him a royal feast, and great style of prayers were being chanted by people, and everything was royal style. And then when he came to the house of the Brahmana, it was very simple. He only had a little mat he could put on the floor. There were flowers from the forest that he picked and so forth. But Krishna appreciated both of them equally because of the principle that both of them were pure devotees, even though their styles were completely different. So that we'll have that diversity also. People come from different cultural backgrounds, but we only appreciate that the purity's there. That mood of pure devotional service is something that, whether the pot is different, we still appreciate the taste. What else? Yes.
Thank you so much. This concept of independent thoughtfulness is really profound to hear in the Bhagavatam lecture, and it reminds me of kind of the mood that some of the more progressive teachers I had in college were promoting. And I have a couple of reflections. One is that I think to people who, there's many, but to people who I feel really embody this concept of independent thoughtfulness are our temple president team, Vaisesika and Krishna. And I say that from my own personal experience coming here in June and having this intention of helping to develop the sustainability of our temple. And basically every single idea I've had that I've shared with both of them, they've supported me, and there's been a lot of progress. Like on our Sunday feasts, they're waste-free now, so everything's compostable. We replaced plastic spoons with metal, so I just washed them at the end. And then we're composting all of our food scraps, and that means that not just boga, but also prashadam is basically infiltrating all of Denver, and then all the Denver soil, so it's becoming expanded down. And then recently I just spoke with both Vaisesika and Krishna, who was about replacing all the lighting with LED, and I calculated that in this temple room, if we were to replace all the chandeliers with LED, right now they're incandescent bulbs, we'd save $15,500 in 15 years. That's about $1,000 a year, and I think it was about 3 new deity outfits for 15 years, so, or 157 cases of Gitas. So I just really think that we have a nice team here, and just encouraging all of you who have ideas in mind, just to bring them forward, because we can really...
I thought you were going to say, I encourage all of you who are listening online to get in your car and drive to Denver right now. We have a house for you here. Thank you very much. Yes, I was thinking the same thing yesterday when I arrived, and I was seeing how things are thriving. That when there's an enlightened touch to encourage growth and individuality, and at the same time there's the right structure, which is to emphasize the principles of pure devotional service, then community can thrive. Living entities thrive when they're given the right environment because they're spiritual. They always expand. So you got to let them live.
I just wanted to again reflect this point that harmony doesn't mean no conflict, but that it means positive dissonance. That there's two completely different notes. But
That's nice. Positive dissonance.
I very much appreciate that point. I did have one question. In terms of sometimes...
That could be the name of one of your albums.
In terms of different challenges that devotees face throughout life, so I've heard devotees express how, there's not always and I can see this, that there's not always like practical help. Or like if you say someone goes to a spiritual guide and they're like, I'm having this it's a material problem. It seemed like and they're saying, I need help, and then it's like, okay, then there's like spiritual solutions. And some devotees may feel dissatisfied that that's not really a solution that I'm looking for. I'm looking for like practical, what's the next step? But I was wondering about this is something that I thought, is that it's not so much the right or wrong. Like, there's not necessarily a right way to do things, but there's a right reason to do things. And if I'm doing something to the best of my ability to please Krishna, if that intention's there, then the right and wrong doesn't so much matter. Is that
That's your question?
Well, is that a proper understanding to have?
Well, I can't see what the first part had to do with the second. I wasn't able to connect it completely, but I'll give an answer based on what I thought you were trying to say, or that what you were. So, as far as practical solutions and also giving spiritual solutions, there are both, and there are different levels from which one can see, and both are necessary. We have to have practical. Prabhupada gave practical solutions all the time. I mean, somebody had a headache, he knew a mixture of black pepper and something else, and he said, here, put this on your head. And it cured their headache. He wasn't averse to practical solutions. And there were very practical things that he did. He got a lot of devotees married, even though he got criticized for it because he was a sannyasi. He saw the need. This culture, people have to be married right away. Otherwise, they're going to not be able to be peaceful enough to perform devotional service. So, avidyam cha chayas tadvedopayam saha. Sri Upanishad said, only one who can learn the process of nescience and that of transcendental knowledge side by side can transcend the influence of repeated birth and death and enjoy the full blessings of immortality. So I find that if you give one without the other, people are left wanting, just as I think you said. So ours is a holistic approach to life, and it includes both, and we should give both practical and philosophical ways in which for people to deal with it. That's consistent with the idea Bhaktivinoda Thakur gives, that we live on two levels. One is vyavaharika, which is a very practical level, that you have to interact with the world. And if you don't, you'll be out of balance for the paramartika, which is the spiritual goal of life. And a lot of people don't understand this. They become sentimental. And for instance, Krishna says in the Bhagavad-gita, Vidya Vinaya Sampane, Brahmani Gavihastani, etc. And that is that there's a way in which an enlightened person sees everyone equally. So then somebody who's untrained in these two levels of existing, Vyavaharika and Paramartika, might say, well, then just treat everybody equally. This is a spiritual principle, but it's misapplied. In the United States, we have a document that said that everyone's created equally. And in what way are they created equally? It would be hard to find any two people that are equal in any way. But on the spiritual platform, they are. However, people go out of their way to apply that spiritual principle on the very practical level, in which you do need to make some discrimination about people's relative capabilities. So both have to be there, and when you offer practical solutions along with the spiritual perspective, you get a lot more out of it in helping people. And there's nothing wrong with having both of those. In fact, they're necessary for our society to work properly. For instance, here, we have devotees that are aging, and there's one devotee here who has gone out of her way to develop systems to help those devotees get government assistance and not just be shut-ins and with no help whatsoever. And that's a practical thing that has to be done. I mean, we have an ashram built by our very own Kuvera, our architect of the what was the architect? Vishwakarma, yeah. And otherwise, we could have just left it the way it was, and everyone could have moved in and lived with black mold the rest of their life. But there's a practical way of addressing these things, and it should be spiritual at the same time. I mean, if your car gets hit, say you're driving your car and it gets hit, I mean, there's two ways that you're going to deal with it. One way is you're going to call the insurance company. And the other way is you're going to get philosophical and you're going to say, well, it's just a car. It's just made out of metal. That's philosophy. And the other part is practical. You got to go tow it in and get reimbursed. Otherwise, you're not going to have another car. So both things should be there. And that brings us to the end of today's session, which is brought to you by Vrinda Sundari Incorporated. The topic again, personhood implies varying perspectives. How to appreciate and harmonize, work together with varying perspectives, varying moods and methods. Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Gaur Bhaktavrinda ki jai, NBA ki jai, New Bhadrak Ashram. Gaur Premanande Haribo, Nitai Gaura Haribo, 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 Nitai Gaura Haribo. Nitai Gaura Haribo, Bo, Haribo, Nitai Gaura Haribo.
Nachari Armarman, Nachari Armarman, Nachari Armarman, hey, Nachari Armarman, Nachari Armarman, Nachari Armarman, Nachari Armarman.